Okay, we were talking about teachers. Teachers are at risk for having a voice disorder due to a number of factors. One is vocal load. Clearly, they do talk a lot. They talk far more than the average person. Um, there are physical factors. I mean, they're not necessarily in good position for speaking much of the time. We'll talk more about that later on. In other words, they're not optimizing their ability to speak physically. They tend to be tense. You all know teachers. Maybe some of you are teachers. They get angry at students. They're very happy with students sometimes. They are intense when they teach. And there are environmental factors that we need to think about too. In the old days, stuff like chalk, certainly dry air, maybe excessive heat, maybe excessive cold. Not all teaching environments are conducive to health. We all know that, and that's an unfortunate reality, though. Teachers really have been looked at quite a bit. There are quite a number of studies, not that there's necessarily agreement, because we have prevalence rates that go all the way from 4 to 50%. But certainly, every time we look at teachers, we say, well, that's more than the average population, the general population. And so they are higher at risk. In the study by Roy, 1,200 teachers versus 1,300 non-teachers, we had just about double the rate of voice problems in teachers as we did in non-teachers. And that's on a particular day. 57%, which is not 11%, but 57% that at some point they did have voice disorders. I don't know what your experience is. I remember clearly a particular teacher when I was a kid in elementary school, and this was always the word, and we're just waiting for it to happen, was going to walk into class at least one day a year and write on the board, yes, chalk and writing on the board, to say, I don't have a voice today, so you all have to behave. And here's what we have to do. And he would write an assignment. We do desk work and blah, blah, blah. Stuff like that. I think there isn't a teacher around, for the most part, who cannot tell you some story about at least once them having, even if they weren't totally incapacitated and couldn't teach at all, but days where they really had to work hard, they had to struggle, they used their voice less, and found other ways to do it. It's not uncommon today to walk through schools and find teachers who are using portable mic and speaker systems and things like that. Certainly in my day, we didn't have that, but I don't think the equipment existed for the most part. Certainly not in small and portable. Okay, and so teachers just do have a lot of problems with voice. Okay. But they're not asking for help, and that's the really fascinating thing. They're not asking for help. And again, something for us to think about. Why not? Teachers are working. Teachers have salaries. Teachers have health insurance. Probably, I can't imagine a population that isn't better equipped to be able to go to a physician or a speech pathologist. They're covered. They all belong to unions, and I'm sure there are exceptions to everything I'm saying, but as a group, they belong to unions. They get paid reasonably well. Nobody's rich, but nobody's impoverished. They all have health insurance of whatever is around today. I don't know. I'm talking to you the day before the inauguration, so I have no idea what I'm really mean by that. And they're not going. They're not going. And so the question is why? And again, it's not because they don't know how. It's not because they don't know how to access care. It's not because they're not covered. We could think about it. I'll give you a couple of hypotheses that I've thought about. One is simply denial. To accept the fact they have a voice disorder is to accept the fact that they have a possibility of not being able to teach. And that's not something any of us in whatever profession we're in really wants to accept easily. Of course I do what I do. I am a teacher, and therefore I will teach. My voice is a problem, so it won't be a problem. I'm just not going to deal with it. It's so much easier to deny it than it is to deal with it. What might happen if I do pursue care? Well, they may tell me I can't teach. They may tell me I have to take extensive leave. They may tell me I have to teach differently. I don't want to hear any of those things, and so I'm just going to deny the fact that I have a problem. I'll cope with it. I will deal with it. Of course, that doesn't really help the problem. Quite a number of years ago, when I still lived in the New York area, I was approached by an individual who ran a kind of a school, not self-help, but an unofficial, self-funded, I think, program working with teachers who are not licensed to be teachers. Whoa, how did that happen? Well, they're not teaching the regular routine courses either. Almost all of them were involved in religious studies. This group happened to all be Jewish, and this was in Brooklyn, so it wasn't so uncommon to find this. They were perhaps rabbis, if not teachers anyway, of Judaic studies subjects, and they all taught religious subjects, and they were teaching kids. Now, they were all, scholarly enough, for sure, to teach their subject, but nobody had training in education. There were private schools. They didn't require, at least in those days, I have no idea what the circumstances today. I'm kind of hoping it changed. They didn't require licensure as a teacher. They weren't getting public funding. And the coordinator of the program, though, what he did notice is that loads and loads of his teachers were just hoarse, and they weren't effective, and they were missing days. And he asked me if I could somehow help. I said, you know what? Here's the first thing. Look, why don't you get all the people together who think they have a voice problem, and let me do a screening. And so I got one of my graduate students, in those days I was at Brooklyn College, and we met with them. And I would say we had almost 100% hit rate. And we always felt like, if he had sent 10 more, we would have found 10 more also. Everybody had a problem. Nobody knew exactly what it was, nor did we, for that matter. We recommended to each of them, I think each of them, that they see an ear, nose, and throat doctor, but we knew that wasn't happening. And so what we had to do, and nor could we ask each of them to have therapy. It wasn't going to happen either. And so what we thought about was, how do we deal with them as a group? And how do we help them? And what we did is we created actually a 6-week workshop, as I recall, 6 sessions. We met once a week for about 2 hours. And what I did with them is basically talked about vocal hygiene, explained a little bit about voice, where it comes from. These people really didn't have a clue about that. How do we abuse it? And how should we be using it? And we went through exercises, and we tried different breathing techniques and speaking techniques and such. Some of the teachers would come back the following week and say, wow, it's like a miracle. It's so different if I do it this way as opposed to the way I've always been doing it. And we were thrilled to hear that. And then there were others who just said from the outset, let's start with this premise. You can tell me whatever you like, but I'm not changing how I teach. Okay, so now help me. And we said, well, I can't. If you're not willing to change anything, there's nothing we can do that's going to help you. And I said, why would you not consider it? He said, because I am a teacher. This is how I teach. And if I need, and literally I remember this one teacher saying, I need to stand on a desk and I need to scream. And I get their attention, and they learn that way. And I'm going, but you can't scream. That just doesn't work. You can get away with that for, a minute a day, but you cannot consistently just keep shouting and screaming. He said, it's my style. It's not changing. And I'm afraid he's not alone. I think there are many people, and that's why I think, frankly, that although we can say that there's a very high percentage of teachers who have voice problems, only 14% are really looking for help. Because the others who have voice problems, who are not in that 14%, although they know of a problem, are not willing to change, and therefore they're not willing to do anything. Okay, it's a problem. Okay. being a teacher, being a woman, being of an age, having a certain amount of education, and that's 16 or more years means you have a college degree or more. And if there's a history of voice disorders, and we haven't talked about that at all yet, have we? How do we get a voice disorder? We kind of hinted, we've been hinting about abuse, but we haven't talked about anything else yet, but we will. We will. That's why this is chapter 1. Okay. Again, if you compare teachers and non-teachers, teachers have a higher absence rate because of voice problems. Not higher in general. I don't know that that's true at all, but certainly they're more likely to call in with voice problems than a bricklayer is likely to call in with voice problems, or an engineer, or a CEO. Okay. And teachers are more likely to consider changing their occupations because of their voice. They're going, listen, I did this for 10 years. I'm still in my early 30s, mid 30s, and I can't do this. I'm just missing way too much because of my voice. I need to find something that doesn't require voice. Okay. What about student teachers? Are they the same as teachers? Well, there have been some studies, not a tremendous number, comparing the incidence of voice complaints in student teachers, and student teachers are certainly higher than their non-student teacher peers. Okay, so if you compare student teachers who don't use their voice as much as teachers do, as opposed to their peers in graduate school, let's say, who are studying, again, math or history or engineering, they're not using their voices all day long, they have a higher rate. Not a surprise for us, I'm sure. Student teachers have more symptoms of dysphonia, throat clearing, coughing, hoarseness, pain in the throat, fatigue, all the things that are associated with having a dysphonia secondary to teaching, misuse of voice while you're teaching. Okay. All right. Here's kind of an interesting and scary statistic, and that is that 90% of the future teachers self-predicted that they would have problems. They had problems, who experienced voice problems during their education, experienced voice problems later. Okay, not a surprise, but it also, in a way, represents a failure for us. It means that we didn't get to them early, we didn't help them, and they all wound up persisting with their voice problem. Only 10% didn't have a voice problem later. That's not a good rate. I'm assuming we didn't get to them when they were student teachers. I think we'd do better than that, but it doesn't seem to have happened. What about speech pathologists? Oh my. You know what? This is a whole new thing. We're going to stop and we're going to go to our next one.